Very challenging readings this morning, some very interesting readings. What does all this talk in the first reading about marriage and vocations and all of those kinds of things? And then here we have Luke's version of the Beatitudes that we hear in other parts of the gospel, of the scriptures. And so, what is this really all about? And I think that on this feast of St. Peter Claver, I believe the word that comes to mind is perspective. Because we know that all things are created by God in this world. Things that we can see, things that we don't see. All these things are created by God. And they are created for a purpose. And Peter Claver, among many in our church who are saints, understood that and put things in perspective. He was born in Spain, and at an early age, he knew he had a vocation. And so when he was 20, he entered the Jesuits. Many of you know about the Jesuits, founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And when you read and hear about Ignatius's life and the spiritual exercises and those things that he did, and it's still proclaimed by the Jesuits today in retreats around the world, it makes perfect sense. These readings make sense because all things can serve the purpose of building our relationship with God, drawing us closer to Him. But we have to begin with a basic foundation or a basic principle. When we read about St. Peter Claver, usually whenever we as clergy, we prepare for a communion service or Mass or even for the day, we read about these saints because their lives can help us. And here are a couple of quotes from St. Peter Claver. To love God as He ought to be loved, we must be detached from all temporal love. Temporal meaning earthly. We must love nothing but Him. Or if we love anything else, we must love it only for His sake. The other quote, to do the will of God, man must despise his own. The more he dies to himself, the more he will live for God. Very challenging readings of St. Peter Claver. But when you understand his theology, theology is nothing more than the way that we understand God. There are many different ways, but same God, one God. Our response is a little bit different based on our life. And so that was the case with Peter Claver when he was born. He was a son of a farmer, hardworking person in the fields, doing chores, those kinds of things. And of course, he saw a lot of people that were workers with him that did not have the same benefits that he had as a family. And so he learned how to work for people. As a matter of fact, St. Peter Claver is the patron of many things, as many saints are. But one of the things he's a patron saint of is the African American community. Many of you know about the Knights of Columbus and may not be aware that there's also a Knights of Peter Claver in our African American community. Matter of fact, our Mother Sarah is just one of our sister parishes close by, has a group, and the job is just very much like St. Vincent de Paul, very much like Columbus. But the reason that Peter Claver did what he did was because of his Jesuit foundations. And if you're familiar at all with the spiritual exercises, and you're familiar with the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, he was a very practical man. And he built his exercises, his spiritual exercises, on a certain principle. It's a principle that we apply today in our own lives. We have to build our house on solid rock, as they say. We have to build it on some strong foundation. And when Ignatius began putting together the spiritual exercises, he built everything on what's called the principles and foundations. In other words, everything else builds up from there and is built on that foundation. And over the years, there have been many interpretations of the foundations and principles. But the one I like is one that was done relatively recently within this 21st century by a Jesuit by the name of Father Fleming, Father David Fleming. And it's a contemporary version. And I think the reason I like it most is that it speaks to us in our contemporary times. But the principle of Ignatius is still the same. And I want to share it with you. And I want you to keep in mind those two quotes that I shared with you from St. Peter Claver's life. Because this is Father David Fleming, contemporary version of Ignatius's Foundations and Principles. The goal of our life is to live with God forever. God, who loves us, gave us life. Our own response of love allows God's life to flow into us without limit. All the things of this world are gifts of God, presented to us so that we can know God more easily and make a return of love more readily. As a result, we appreciate and use all these things of God insofar as they help us develop as living persons. But if any of these gifts becomes the center of our lives, they displace God and so hinder our growth toward our goal. In everyday life, then, we must hold ourselves in balance before all of these created things, insofar as we have a choice and are not bound by some obligation. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one. For everything has the potential of calling forth in us a deeper response to our life in God. Our only desire and our one choice should be this: I want and I choose what better leads to God's deepening his life in me. So I think you can begin to understand the first reading about marriage. What it's saying is that there's not one way. Some people are called to the single life, some people are called to married life, some people are called to religious vocations. All those things are good, and it's individual responses to God's love. Not one is not better than the other. They all have the way of drawing us into deeper relationship with God, should we choose that. I recall when I was here at the Cathedral, one of my ministries was to teach the confirmation class. And one of the questions I used to ask them, especially at confirmation, 16, 17 years old, they're preparing for college perhaps or life and have some vision of what they might want to do. And so I'd always ask them, have you decided what you want to go to study in college? Or do you want to go to college? Or do you want to go to technical school? Or what do you want to do? And they would give me various answers. I said, well, let me ask you this question. Have you asked God what he wants you to do? And like most teenagers, when I was young, I would have had the same answer. No, not really. Because that's kind of the way of the world. See, when we hear the Beatitudes, as we did in the gospel reading, it kind of jars our mind because it's outside of the common sense of what we have. And it's kind of harsh because it blesses those who are weak and it warns those who are strong and rich. That seems contrary to our common understanding. But what Peter Claver and what our church and what Ignatius is telling us is things are held in balance. Yes, those who are gifted with wealth, thanks be to God. There are people who have that gift. And many are very generous because they understand that the wealth is not so much their own, but a gift from God, as Ignatius says at his Foundations and Principles. So today, on this feast of St. Peter Claver, let us remember that we have been given gifts to use by God. And the gifts that we are given by God to use is not to build up ourselves, but to build up his kingdom. St. Peter Claver understood that. St. Ignatius understands that. And today in this communion service, we are called to make it personal to ourselves. And what gifts has God given me? How am I going to use that to help to build the kingdom? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.